Welcome, everyone. I'll just put the microphone down. Welcome to the first keynote of our 21st World Congress of the International Economic Association. President Vučić kicked us off on a theme that Jean Tirole is going to take up in his keynote when he said, we do not all see the world in the same way. And the lecture is entitled Engineering Commonality. And Jean began his academic career with 2 degrees in engineering, so we are on solid ground here, before taking his PhD with Eric Maskin. He then invested in serious institution building in Toulouse at the Toulouse School of Economics, and then with the multidisciplinary IAST. The Nobel Prize has already been mentioned, and I'm not going to recite Jean's contributions. What I wanted to do is to just give a brief introduction to some of the themes that Jean is going to be talking about. And I think to sort of ground us, we might think back to the 2006, so 20 years back to the Incentives and Pro-Social Behavior paper, which highlighted this puzzle at the heart of mechanism design and really kind of pushed the profession into thinking about these questions of what is it that keeps societies, that keeps firms, teams working together. And we can think of a whole number of other examples. Why do we comply with sorting out our garbage, for example? And the big fork in the road was to show that where a standard mechanism design explains this by setting incentives right, what Benabou and Tirole show is that this can be self-defeating. And this theme of the potential of crowding out is going to come back in Jean's lecture today in a different way. And as then, the reason resides in the role of information. So competitive incentive escalation can destroy the value of the signal on which intrinsic motivations depend. So these themes were taken up again in Jean's 2017 book, Economics for the Common Good. But what his lecture today does is to dig into one aspect of these issues, and that's the question of how are social norms sustained. So again, touching on what President Vučić raised in his talk. Is it better to know more rather than less about those we interact with? More information may drive trust and pro-social behavior down. So this is potentially another form of crowding out. Engineering commonality provides a map of this new territory, and as usual, there are some surprising results. Please welcome Jean Tirole.
Good morning, and thank you, Wendy, for those very kind words. And thank you to the International Economic Association and the Serbian Association of Economists for organizing so efficiently this wonderful meeting. This research is based on something that won't have escaped from you, that we live in troubled times, and they are marked by illiberalism, transactional geopolitics, nationalism, and war. At the same time, we remain inattentive, dangerously so, to the existential threat confronting us, including climate change, and unless we establish appropriate safeguards, artificial intelligence. Even when conflicts take less violent forms, the erosion of trust and solidarity carries profound consequences. This evening, I will explore some of the consequences as I will discuss the current predicament of middle powers, with Europe serving as an important particular example. What is urgently needed is a rebuilding of social bonds, a new renewed sense of kinship, shared purpose, and common humanity. This challenge extends across all levels of collective life, among nations, within communities, inside organizations, and even in our personal relationships. This morning, I would like to take a step back and develop an abstract framework that forms the first pillar of a much broader research agenda, both theoretical and empirical, on what makes societies and organizations function effectively. Now, the questions I'm going to tackle are not new. And actually, I would like to begin by inviting you to reflect on the following two quotations. The first quotation is by sociologist Georg Simmel. All relationships of people to each other rest upon the precondition that they know something about each other. So to work together, we have to know at least a little bit about each other. But then, philosopher and historian Ernest Renan, in an even earlier quote, says, now the essence of a nation, in the particular case he was talking about the nation, is that all individuals have many things in common, and also that they've forgotten many things. And that's actually very important as well. And this is what Wendy said, at some point, information can crowd out intrinsic motivation, and that may be bad. So this is going to be a rather abstract treatment, but I hope I can convey the idea. This afternoon's talk will be much more policy-oriented, but this one is really trying to develop a framework. And it's based on the idea that societies and organizations, whether they are firms, nations, religions, tend to emphasize what unites the members and try to avoid what divides them. So they try to disseminate and also forge shared attributes, encourage team building, and curb discussions of divisive topics. And by the way, what we learn at school is history, and almost every country, with very varying degrees, of course, manufacture their history. Actually, it's no longer an history, it's a memory. It's a memory in favor of a particular group of people who want to share some beliefs about what has happened in the past. History is very rare, and it's not a good time actually to be an historian, as we all know, just like it's not a good time to be a social scientist or a climate scientist or someone in biology, because that's a topic of division. Now, very often, actually, common identity is forged in an unfortunate way, which is basically using an out-group to make in-group members forget about their differences. If people look further away from you than other people, then your in-group will look more united. So the threat of a common enemy actually is often used in order to create this commonality. Political scientist Lewandowski actually argues, pretty informally, but he argues that there is a current concern about shared values, that's pretty clear, and that there is pluralistic ignorance or exaggeration of the affective polarization. So he uses the case of Democrats and Republicans in the US and argues basically that the media is there to emphasize what divides. The blood is always very attractive, of course. By the way, a lot of that happens in social media as well. There are people who are working on the regulation of social media, like Leo Bernstein at the University of Chicago, and I think it's very important work because it's really some stuff that not only insulates us from others, but also creates a lot of polarization. But what Lewandowski says is that we should prime identity, shared identity. So even so, you might think Democrats and Republicans are far apart. They all vouch for the Red Sox. They're all American citizens. they're all spouses and parents, and in that sense, they have shared value. Now, whether it's going to be sufficient is another ballgame, but at least we have to feel closer to each other, even so we have very different opinions. Now, there are two questions about commonality. One is, why do we care? And that's the answer will be relatively simple. And the second question is, how do we achieve it? And that's a little bit more difficult. So economists have for a long time emphasized the fact that commonality is a lubricant that makes organization and society operable. And there are several mechanisms. And actually, much of what we know about organization is about creating more commonality of goals. So we create teamwork. It's very important, teamwork with certain specificity. It's very important that you have this commonality for people to work together, for them to share information, respond to others' advice, to delegate. If you trust people, you delegate much more, of course. And also to speak up. It's very important in an organization that people admit their mistakes without reputational consequences, because otherwise, people shut up. And they don't dare to go against the boss, against their colleagues. They don't speak. So it's very important they speak up, but that requires trust. Now, this is just a rational part, which we economists usually formalize, but of course there is a behavioral pathway. So we tend to cooperate much more when we feel altruism toward the in-group. And some of it is kind of hardwired. I mean, it's, like keen altruism. We have the same hometown, or with the same origin, the same taste. We like the Red Sox. And that's going to, I should take a soccer team, but then that will probably be a divisive topic today. Anyway, but it's direct, so we feel more altruism, but it's also indirect because when we have affinities, we tend to meet more often at the coffee machine or outside work. And that means that we're involved in a broader repeated game, and therefore we tend to cooperate more. And there is a lot of evidence in psychology and economics about the fact that hardwired behavior, whether we like them or not, actually are efficient in terms of creating corporations. Now, how do we do it? Again, economics have something to be saying about that. So we are used to say we should create a well-aligned incentive environment to promote teamwork. So for example, we should offer team pay or cooperative pay rather than benchmarking or competitive pay. We should limit turnover, because if there is a perception of a long-standing relationship with your fellow employees, then you are part of a repeated game, and it's going to promote cooperation. We want to create small groups for exactly the same reason, which is that if you have small groups, you have a more frequent relationship, and you are less tempted to free ride. And you have to define clear tasks and compelling directions as a coordination device. The research I'm doing focuses on a different and newer aspect, which is the information channel. How do you create some feeling of commonality, not through incentive, but through information? How you feel the other person is like, and is this person congruent with you? And I interpret Georg Simmel's quotation about knowing each other as learning about commonality, where commonality refers to whatever will induce cooperation in teams, from rational trust to hardwired sense of similarity. Whatever. I don't care, in a sense, whether it's rational or less rational. We want to create commonality. Now, there are two ways in which this informational commonality can be created. One is by having people exchange, learning to know each other, and that's what we're going to focus mostly this morning. But there is another important thing which has to do with communication by the leadership. Basically, the leadership, whether it's political, religious, organizational, is trying to convince members of a common identity, common values. And this other project I have with Mohamed Saleh, which is an empirical project on Commonality, envisions commonality entrepreneurs, and of course, imaginary common histories. In the case, it's the Oriental Christianity, and early Arab caliphates, trying to understand how this commonality was created. And I may say a few more words about this. Now, if you have listened to me so far, then you will have noticed that, it's a bit suspicious, right? Do I believe what he's telling us? And there are two reasons why my story may not hold water. The first is that when people get to know each other, they may discover good news about each other. They are alike, they can trust each other because they have similar tastes, they are congruent. But they may also learn bad news, and that's not good. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if commonality matter, then we are going to be strategic about it. So we may lie about who we are, just to make sure that the other person trusts us. And therefore, there is a communication issue about truth-telling, which involves truth-telling. Okay? So what I do is to develop a model that captures the essence of the argument, and, well, let's see where it leads us. Let's keep that, we don't have time. So from now on, it's going to be pretty abstract, but I hope you get something, even if you are not too interested in the theory, you get something in terms of the intuition, and I'll try to give some. There are really two players. Just for simplicity, we have two players, and they are going to work together. You can have a third player who is a principal, but really the active players will be those two agents. So think of them as being workers or countries or divisions or something like that, and we'll index the players by eye. Now, we are going to make an assumption, which is very reasonable, is that the organization functions better if two agents perceive themselves as being congruent. So if we pull in the same direction, it's going to work. If we pull in different directions because we have different objectives, it's not going to work. So you want to be congruent, to have many things in common. And we are going to start with a thought experiment where we are going to have common knowledge beliefs at each point of the communication protocol about how congruent we are. So I'm going to call mu the probability that we are congruent. So there will be two states of nature, we are congruent or we are not, and we are going to learn about it, and mu will be the probability that the state of nature, which I will call omega, is equal to 1. 1 minus mu is the probability that it's equal to 0. So those are the beliefs, and they will result from some abstract experiments, basically exchange of information. Do you like the Red Sox, for example? Kind of thing. Now, we start with some prior beliefs, mu0, and we are going to assume that those posterior beliefs will be common knowledge along the way. So mu will be the final posterior belief, and it will be common knowledge. Now, you may be suspicious about that because the fact that we're communicating means there is an incentive compatibility issue, and we may lie about our taste. Okay, so I took the Red Sox example because I have Eric Maskin in front of me, and if I know he likes the Red Sox, and furthermore he was my advisor, so it just better please him, and we're still working together. So I would say, oh, I love the Red Sox. Of course, Eric, I love the Red Sox, right? So there is an incentive compatibility issue. But for the moment, we abstract from it. We say that people are totally truthful. They don't like to lie. They follow the communication protocol. And that will be a building block for the real stuff where you have incentive compatibility. We are going to assume there will be two stages, one of communication and one of working together. And the payoff for agent I will be called VI, which is an increasing function of perceived congruence. Okay? Actually, we'll assume a little bit more. We'll assume for simplicity, and that will be the case in all the examples I will give you, that this perf function is convex. Probably you see it the wrong way, but convex and then concave. So basically that captures the fact, by the way, it can be all concave or all convex, it's a special case, but the idea is that effective relationship must build on sufficient mutual ground, but not necessarily on the agent being congruent, fully congruent, seeing eye to eye on everything. So that's the idea. And so we have to know something, just like in Georg Simmel, you have to know something about each other. It may not be needed to know everything about each other. Okay? The timing is, first there is a communication stage, which I will describe in more detail, but think of that abstractly as an experiment, which is going to yield a cumulative distribution at the end of the communication game, Q of mu, over the common posterior beliefs, in a class of feasible posterior beliefs. So a big difference for those of you who know information design is that information design, you can basically generate beliefs you want. I mean, here you have to basically get a subset, and I will indicate. Of course, you will be bound by the martingale property, which is that the expected posterior has to be the prior. And then once we have those common beliefs mu about the congruence, we'll be playing a game. Again, it's very abstract, and they will be reduced from P of Vi of mu, okay? And by the way, I can include the principle. So I gave you the two interpretations. One is agents exchange trait information that and are truthful and obedient in it, or it could be information which is supplied by the principle. Now, if you think about doctoring of history, the creation of commonality around a religion or whatever, this is more the second one. But I'll be focusing on it. So if you want to have an example, let's think about the following game. Imagine that we are going to work together. Okay, that's the foregone conclusion. But we are going to decide how much effort we are going to put on a job. So the intensive margin. So agents are congruent, so omega equals 1 or not, but they don't know it. They have some common beliefs mu about it, and that's it. Let's assume, for example, it's 0 or 1, and we have to decide at stage 2 whether to exert effort or not. Okay. Oh, of course. Yeah. Okay, so let's assume there is a cost of effort where you can think of theta I as being motivation. Theta 1 is greater than theta 2. That means that agent 1 is the more motivated. Maybe the cost of effort is smaller. So agent 2 is kind of the weak link. Agent 2 is the one who hard to convince to work. So think about this as being, say, productivity will be alpha times A1 plus A2 over 2, and then there is some kind of supermodular term in which beta is positive. If we both work, it works better, but also if we are congruent, it's also going to be better because we are going to pull in the same direction as opposed to opposite direction, and omega is basically the state of nature. So that will be a mu once you take probabilities. Now, the agents, they don't care only about productivity, they care also about their cost of effort, and that's why they will think twice about actually exerting effort. And beta is positive, so you have strategic complementarity. If you have multiple equilibria, don't worry, make a selection, for example, the best equilibrium for the agents. That's not crucial. Now, you can complicate things a little bit by assuming that, for example, gamma is random, so you'll get a smoother payoff, and we'll see that in a minute. So not only you don't know about congruence omega, but there might be some common shock gamma which occurs after the communication stage, but before this work stage happens. Okay, there are lots of other examples you can think of. which you can read the paper if you're interested, like parochial altruism, different priors, ancillary interaction. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say. But I'm going to, there will be a weak link and a strong link. So let me illustrate this. So if gamma is known, for example, then if gamma is known, basically the payoffs are actually, there's a threshold. The threshold, you cannot have any work if you don't have enough trust in each other. And actually, given that 2 is a weak link by assumption, that means the threshold will be, I'm not terribly good at doing this. It's a nice technology, but anyway. So basically, it's the threshold mu at which they are going to work is going to depend on the weak link, because the weak link has the less motivation to work. And basically, you will have something. So the payoff will be 0. There won't be any effort if mu is less than mu to lower bar, and then it's going to be linearly increasing with mu. Now, if you assume that gamma is random, so it will be learned between the communication stage and the work stage, then, and f of gamma is log concave, then you smoothen things. So you see this is concave convex. Jesus, this is very technical. Okay. So much for this. So on the left, where you have a threshold case, then basically you need some minimum congruence, and you see it's convex concave, right? And on the right, we smooth things through this cost noise, and it's still convex concave, but in a much smoother way. I didn't tell you how they are going to learn. So there may be many processes through which they learn. So I'm just going to make an assumption later on, but let me illustrate this assumption. So you might, for example, learn from binary experiments. So Eric and I talk about, the Red Sox. Do you like it or not? And then with Wendy, we're going to talk about Starmer. Do you like him or not? And we are going to exchange information about various things about our traits, our goals, maybe our experience. And each time there will be some news. So for example, if we are congruent on this particular item, on this feature, then that's more likely that we are congruent in the first place. So if omega equals 1, there is probability rho 1 that you get a high signal of congruence. Omega equals 0, there's probability rho 0 that you have a low signal. And this condition here, no, this is not this is not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. Basically, the idea is that high signal is a signal of congruence and low signal the reverse. And there are many things which have been considered in literature, like the bad news model. So you may learn that omega equals 0, but as long as you don't learn, no news is good news, so your posterior increases. Good news model is the reverse, where you may learn good news, but that means if you don't get any news, that's bad news. You can have the choice in each stage of the thing between good news and bad news. You can have Bernoulli. We'll illustrate a few things because it's a bit simpler if you have low learning unless you have some conclusive evidence that omega equals 0, omega 1. So that means the posterior beliefs will be moving very slowly. That avoids having to do approximations of the optimal scheme. This is really... it doesn't have to be binary. So for example, you could have a conclusive Poisson process where sometimes you learn omega equals 1, sometimes you learn omega equals 0, otherwise you don't get any signal. You can have all kinds of processes. So the demand for communication, this is information design. So what kind of communication will agent 1 would like to have? What kind of communication will agent 2 like to have? What about the principal? Because the principal could say things like don't ask, don't tell. we have, in information design, you basically maximize the payoff function, the expected payoff of the agent, if you're agent I, subject to the martingale property, of course, and subject, and that's a possible difference with information design, is that you can get only certain posterior beliefs. So for example, if you have the bad news model, you can get 0 and some other beliefs. Okay, that's it. You cannot get other types of beliefs, other cues, right? So let's take an example. I was talking about bad news. Look at the left diagram here. So here I've shown the V1. Remember, V1 is a strong link. It's more eager to collaborate because the cost is lower. And V2 is basically the weak links. That's a smooth case where you have a random gamma, otherwise it will be the threshold case. And there's a well-known result in information design that actually the optimal information structure in information design is either 0, I mean, you reconcavify here, but it's either 0 or what I call mu IB, where B is for bad news. That's for agent 1. And same thing for agent 2, it's 0 or mu 2B. And basically, you want, intuitively, you want to move along the convex part, because then you are risk-loving in respect to information, and then the concave part. It's a bit more complicated than that, but by and large, in the concave part, you just don't want to get any more information. It's too risky. Okay? So you have those 2 points here, and then those 2 points basically tells you what the optimal is. And it turns out, and this is very special to the bad news case and to some other cases, that actually you can implement, at least in the slow learning case, where posterior beliefs move slowly, you can implement this. And I'm going to... so let's focus on the slow learning case and with smooth payoff. So what happens is that let's assume that mu is less than mu IB, agent I would like to keep on learning as long as mu is less than mu IB, because it will bring you to this upper point or to 0. And you see that, and if you start with mu 0 greater than mu IB, you stop immediately because, you're in the concave part. You don't want to keep learning. Okay? So that particular case means that you can actually achieve the information design outcome. And by the way, that also means that if you have the choice between good news and bad news, you'll focus on bad news entirely. You don't want to learn through the good news process. Okay? That's also what you get with Bernoulli and slow learning. You get exactly the same thing. But you don't get the same thing if you have the good news model, for example, because in the good news model, you are going to end up at 1. And 1 is not part of an optimal scheme, as you have seen. So the optimal scheme will be more complex. Actually, the properties under, say, for player I is that you want to learn. Now, no news is bad news. So if you have no news, you go towards 0. And basically, you want to learn as long as mu is less than mu IG here, and to stop if mu is greater than mu IG. In that case, there is no way you can get the information design outcome because you are constrained in the process that you are using to learn about commonality. Okay? Same thing, by the way, if you have conclusive Poisson signal, you cannot get the information design outcome. Okay, but what's important for what follows, and is that okay? What's important with what follows is the notion of relative information aversion, and that applies to all cases. And there's only one assumption we have to make now. It's basically that agent I would like to keep experimenting if mu is less than some mu I star, and would like to stop experimenting if mu is greater than mu I star. That's all we are going to need. So we have cases. So for bad news, for example, mu I star is equal to mu IB. For good news, mu I star is equal to mu IG, but it doesn't matter. What we have is, there's a region where you have a low probability of congruence, so you want to keep learning about each other, and if you have high congruence, you want to stop learning. You know enough, and you don't want to know more. Okay, that's because you have convex concavity. Okay, let me just... So that brings me to the real stuff. What I said was just a building block for where we are going. So I told you should be suspicious of everything I say. It's true in general, but it's true in particular in this case. Here you have, the question is whether it's incentive compatible. After all, people can lie. So they can lie in two ways. One, they can fail to disclose hard information, or they can, if it's cheap talk, they can misrepresent their information. It's pretty easy. Okay? And on top of that, they cannot respect the protocol. So the protocol says, you have to stop when mu is greater than mu I star. And the mu I star is not even the same for both players. Okay? So what's going on? So far we have assumed that people were obedient, they follow the communication protocol, they are truthful, they disclose their information, whether soft or hard, when it's requested. So what I do is to microphone the model in the previous section. So imagine that agents know T dimensions, their taste in that feature, or what they have done in the past, or what their goals are, or whatever. And so they have T dimensions, and each dimension tells you something about dimension 0. Dimension 0 is your taste for this particular task that you are going to accomplish with the other person. So in dimension T, agent I mean, this is one way to formalize it. Agent I has some type theta IT drawn uniformly on 0, 1. And the draws are perfectly correlated with property rho 1 in the state of congruence, and 1 minus rho 0 instead of nature omega equals 0. Otherwise, they are independent draws, which means they are never going to be the same. Okay? So you have a multidimensional type. On dimension T, I have a type, you have a type. And the fact that they are the same basically makes it more likely that we have congruent on the task we are going to accomplish. Okay? And you can consider hard information disclosure, soft information disclosure. You could also consider hybrid information disclosure, but let's focus on those two. So remember, under hard information, basically, when you show evidence, that's clearly something that is verifiable by the other person. So your only degree of freedom is not to show the evidence if you want to lie. With soft information, you can, so I can show to Eric all the Red Sox tickets I've used. That's hard information, maybe. Or I can tell Eric, oh, I love the Red Sox, right? Either way. That's hard or soft. Soft information, you can basically communicate theta IT is 0, 1. You can communicate any element of 0, 1. You can even shut up if you want. So it turns out that the outcome and which is going to result from communication is going to depend very much on whether you have hard or soft information. I'm going to skip a few technical details like elimination of weakly dominant strategies and the like, and just tell you the economics behind it. So we first have to add a communication protocol. So one way of doing it, which is fine, is basically to have sequential communication. So Wendy speaks and I speak, and Wendy speaks and I speak, and so on. And then when we don't disclose anything anymore, we stop and we work together. Okay? Another one is basically en bloc disclosure, where we choose TI dimension and we disclose along the TI dimensions. And if the numbers coincide, then we work. It's done, communication is over. If it's not the same, then the one was disclosed less has an opportunity to disclose more to match the number of dimensions. It's one way, it gives you the same result, and I don't have the general result, but I think any communication protocol will give you the same. So basically, everything is in the little picture down there. I should have made it bigger. But basically, imagine that mu1 star is less than mu2 star. So basically, the agent 1 is less eager to exchange information. It's not quite the same as being the strong link. It depends. On the many examples, it's the same, but not on all of them. But as I said, the important thing is who is the most information averse. And the most information averse, we're going to assume is agent 1. Okay? That's all we need. Now, if you start with low congruence, perceived congruence, so you are below mu1 star, then both want to learn about each other because the relationship is not going to work well. So they're both eager to learn about each other. And odd information means that you're going to announce your type. Of course, you run the risk of bad news, but that's life. And you're going to disclose your type. When mu is greater than mu2 star, they both want to stop learning. They know enough. Even agent 2 wants to stop. And then they stop learning, they stop communicating, and they start working. The problem is what's going on in between. Because that's the only place where there is a conflict of interest. Agent 2 would like to continue, agent 1 would like to stop. Okay, because agent 1, say, gains more from the relationship and doesn't want to endanger the relationship. But the thing is, and that's where hard information and soft information is very, very different. Hard information means that you can force the other person to disclose. Okay? So if Eric wants to know whether, sorry, I should stop with this Red Sox thing. I realize it may not be the optimal one. But yeah, let's keep on doing the Red Sox. So, if Eric really wants to know whether I like the Red Sox and he says, show me your tickets, then either I show my tickets just to say, Eric, we love each other, we are going to form a great team together, or I don't have Red Sox tickets, but of course Eric will interpret this as my silence as is not congruent or is unlikely to be congruent. So without information, the one with information loving is going to be able to force the information averse to disclose. And the outcome basically will be the outcome which is preferred by the information loving agent. Okay? So that's a very simple result. And there will be, any refusal to disclose will be interpreted as being bad news and so on, so that's not going to work. So let's keep the proposition. Okay? There's actually an interesting thing, I won't have time to discuss it. What happens if you have plausible deniability? So I'm sorry. Before I mentioned that I could say I don't have the information, but here I have the information. Now let's assume that I may not even have the information. So maybe I had Red Sox tickets in the past, but I lost them. That's a possibility. And then there is a little bit more. It's a bit more complicated, and what happens is that the interesting part is actually even for bad news, information design outcome may not be reachable, and the agent may define acceptable discourse themselves. So before they even start communicating, they are going to say, let's not talk about this, it's off the table. Because if you turn out not to have information to communicate, the absence of communication will be perceived as suspicious, and that's going to create. So you better say, let's not discuss this ex ante. Okay, so if you have soft information, then it's a reverse. So maybe I could go back to this diagram. It's the same diagram in a sense, but let's assume that it's common knowledge I don't have Red Sox tickets. And then Eric asked me, do you like the Red Sox? And I say, oh, I love the Red Sox, of course. And this is cheap talk. And there's always, so, the previous behavior, which consisted in saying, I'm going to force you to disclose what you know, doesn't work, because if you start saying, I love the Red Sox, what about you? I say, I love the Red Sox. It's cheap talk, right? So I will want to appear congruent, because it's a dominant strategy to appear congruent. So you're going to get exactly the reverse, which is that the two parties will stop learning when mu reaches mu1 star. So basically, the information averse one under cheap talk will have its say. It's going to determine the outcome. Under hard information, it's going to be the information loving one who is going to have its say. Okay. So let's reinterpret a little bit. We have a bit of time, but it's also nice if we finish a little bit early, I guess, because there is a coffee break. But in terms of reinterpretation of this model, but also, in terms of basically allies for future research. So remember Ernest Renan's very important insight that to be together we have to forget lots of things. Okay, it's true for any relationship, but this is important, and it's easy to say. Of course, if we want to work together, we have to forget about the past disputes. Okay, and that's very, very important. We just take that off our brain. The problem with that is that there is a mechanism which works in the opposite way, which is that if there's been a past conflict, attribution means that we want, for our own self-esteem, think that we are not responsible for the past conflict. It was the other person, the other organization, the other country who was responsible for the conflict. And there's a rationale to that, because it's self-esteem maintenance. So we may hold grudges against the other person, the other country. Even so, from an efficiency perspective, it would be much better if we forgot about our past conflicts. And this is very important, as you know, in international relationships, for example. If we rehearse all the time what has divided us, then that's bad. But that's a natural mechanism, I must say. Another interesting thing has to do with one thing I didn't talk about is, I talk about effort in a team, for example. But what about forming a team in the first place? It's the same mathematical tools, but it's very important because, you have a choice between being in a team, a partnership or whatever, some friendship, which is rewarding but fragile, depends on how congruent you are in particular, and what's called bowling alone. Nowadays it would be called social network, right? And one of the things is that if there's a decline in trust and the willingness of others to build trust and commonality, then you might be better off bowling alone, and that with societal consequences which are not great. There's this issue, I hardly talk about organization. There's this issue about boundary setting. What are you allowed to talk about? And, you know, you are in a firm. Can you talk about your sexuality? Can you talk about your politics, your religion? And this is another area I've been working on. Those are divisive issues, and that may create conflict within the organization. That may also create stronger organizations. So, you know, very few organizations actually, you know, recommend speaking about those issues. But, you know, Ben & Jerry in the US will say, no, we have to discuss. Then that might be a screening device to get people who think alike as employees and therefore have more commonality. But often what they do is that they push that into what they call employee resource groups, which are basically sub-organizations where there won't be any conflict. So it might be a group discussing LGBT+, or politics, or whatever. But, you know, within a group of people in which there won't be any conflict. So the boundary setting thing I haven't studied, but it's actually very important in terms of managerial thing. And then there is a low versus high community environment, which I think is very important. So I'm in Toulouse, I love rugby, and I go to the rugby game, and I'm having a good time, and people next to me also are having a good time, of course, because Toulouse wins all the time. But, you know, we're having a good time, and do I want to know about their politics? Probably not. You know, I might be upset. I go to a cafe, and you know, I'm drinking my espresso with people enjoying themselves in the cafe. Do I really want to know the politics of the coffee owner? Probably not. And same thing with a taxi driver. This is an environment where you don't need much commonality, except on the fact that you love rugby. But you know, the fact that you went to a rugby game is already clear. So those are things where you don't, you know, this mu I star is pretty low in those things. You don't want to exchange too much information. You're having a good time. Why spoil it, right? But there are other domains where you want to know more about each other. And, you know, there is a lot of empirical work to do on that. I think it's important. Let's not talk. Let me conclude with another project, which is on commonality narratives, which has to do with an old theme. You know, I mentioned history and the difference between history and memory. Anderson wrote this very nice book called Imagine Communities. The title says it all. You know, the way leaders of communities, politicians, religious leaders, whatever, actually construct some common story, some commonality. Actually, if you read a number of Harari's books, they're about that. You know, the idea that you have some story which is shared. Doesn't matter whether the story is right or wrong. I mean, it must have a grain of truth, but you know, it's not necessarily right. And actually, most of the stories are wrong. You know, and we also do that. You know, with our departments, with our organization. We also say, you know, we have those values. Okay, we have a picture of ourselves, and as I will explain, if I have time this afternoon, you know, that's one of the things which is missing a little bit for Europe. So, you know, in the bad case, you know, the patriotic propaganda is actually can be viewed as a search for commonality. The rewrite of history, which takes place in all countries, but I say, you know, much more in some countries than in others, is really part of it. We against them. Now, this was captured very well by Orwell, of course. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And you know, you hear all the time, don't smear our history. And you know, you have all those rituals which are very important when it comes to basically getting the nation together. National anthem, actually you say, the soccer games, soccer World Cup, the language and so on, which creates, and it's really hardwired. It's really a sense of similarity, which is a little bit superficial, but it works. It creates a sense of similarity, which is important. Okay. What we do with Mohamed Saleh, I mean, we still have a fair amount of work to do, but as I mentioned, we look at a religious group in the Middle East prior to the Muslim invasion in 641 in all those countries, Egypt, Syria, and so on. Well, what's now Egypt and Syria and so on. You had Christian groups. I mean, there was no Muslims there. So you had Christian groups, but you didn't have just the Copts and the Melkites or the Orthodox, but there were actually over 10 relatively big groups, Christian groups, and then there was a process of, I'm an IO economist, of mergers and acquisitions, basically where they merged into a subset of religions, and the Copts and the Melkites actually were the winner of these merger waves. But what we study is really how moral narratives and historical narratives are different. Moral narratives, what do you value? The nature of Christ, for example. But also historical narrative, how you tell your history and you manipulate your history. Have influenced basically this process of absorption, consolidation, of syncretism. At a time where there is, of course, this big threat for the Christianity, which was, of course, the Muslims, which is something we studied in the past in terms of the way the Muslims actually were very good at using economic mechanisms to induce conversions. But it was a pretty efficient way of basically exploiting the willingness to pay to remain Christian. So whatever, it's very important that we get more evidence on this issue of commonality building, but also what it implies for the evolution of history and moral values, and that's what we are trying to do. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I want you to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. What Jean has done yet again, is to take a first-order problem, a problem that's become, I think, much more pressing with the different ways in which an excess of information has emerged and is likely to continue doing so. But he's given us a framework, a really clear framework where we can begin to tease out the importance of too much, too little information in different settings. We can think about the mafia, the taxi driver, but also the question of information and how it can be used in sustaining pro-social behavior for the public good. So I'd like you to join me in thanking Jean. It was a fantastic opening, a really deep opening to our World Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. Thank you.